I grew up a couple of miles from the stores in this book. I hope you like this one. Chapter 1. Jessica Moore had a skip in her step as she walked to town. Usually, she had a sibling or two tagging along, but her siblings were all at school. Thank heavens for September 1st. She'd finished school a few years before, when she was just 18, and she'd been helping her mother with her younger siblings ever since. She was the oldest of the 6 Moore children, who were often compared to the demon horde, and not necessarily in a favorable manner. Jessica was sometimes appalled at the way her younger brothers and sisters acted, but there was nothing she could do about it. Even as an unpaid mother's helper for her mother. Never mind, though, because school was back in, and she got to run all the errands for the family while the monsters were in school. First she stopped at the general store in town, purchasing the things her mother had put on the list she held and asking that it all be delivered. It was time to start harvesting and canning, but her mother had thankfully promised it wouldn't need to start for a full week, giving them both some time to breathe. As always, she stopped at the back of the store to read through the advertisements there. A family she knew needed a servant, but she was aware of how little the mother did, and how much was expected of anyone working for them, so that was definitely a no. Then she spotted the ad she saw every time she looked at the bulletin board at least once a week. Mail order brides wanted for men out west. Report to Elizabeth Tandy at. Jessica had looked at and dismissed the notion of going west as a mail order bride dozens of times over the past few years. Now, suddenly, it seemed right. She knew Mrs. Tandy was the elder sister of the demon horde, but that didn't bother her. Elizabeth had never been involved in her younger siblings' shenanigans. Jessica looked at the note again and decided to detour before going to the post office. She'd still be home in time to help with supper, which was really all that mattered to her mother. As long as school was in. They tried to divide and conquer with the younger children when school was out. She made the short walk to Rock Creek Road and the mansion the Tandys lived in. It stood on the street in town where all the wealthiest citizens lived. Jessica took a deep breath and walked to the door, knocking loudly before she lost her courage. A man came to the door, and Jessica recognized him as Mrs. Tandy's one-time butler and now husband. "I'm looking for Mrs. Tandy," Jessica said softly. Mr. Tandy nodded and smiled. "Yes, of course. Are you here to answer her advertisement for mail-order brides?" "Yes, sir. I am." Having Mr. Tandy act as if all was normal about her answering an ad gave Jessica fresh confidence. She wouldn't be committed just because she answered an ad. "Come in." Mr. Tandy opened the door wide and led her down the hall to the last door on the left. "Elizabeth, I have someone here to talk to you about being a mail-order bride." He looked at Jessica. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name." "I'm Jessica Moore. I went to school with Mrs. Tandy's younger siblings." "You survived the demon horde?" Elizabeth asked, getting to her feet and smiling. "I'm impressed." Jessica smiled. "I'm afraid my younger siblings are often compared to the demon horde. When one of your siblings suggests frightening the teacher, my siblings come up with all the horrible ways they can possibly think of." Elizabeth chuckled. "Come in. We'll have to trade horror stories." "I have more than my share," Jessica said. "I do as well." Elizabeth looked at her husband. "Lemonade and cookies?" He nodded. "I'll be right back with both." As Mr. Tandy shut the door, Elizabeth smiled. "Are you hoping to be a mail-order bride?" Jessica nodded slowly. "I've been looking at your ad on the bulletin board of the store for a very long time. I go to the store, I check to see if it's still there as I look through the other ads, praying there will be work for me that doesn't involve my own siblings. I finished school 4 years ago, and I have no marriage prospects. My siblings have scared away every man who has tried to court me. So I'm throwing myself upon your mercy and begging you to find me a husband." Elizabeth's smile was full-blown by the time Jessica finished. How do you feel about children who are not your siblings? Jessica shrugged. I like children. Good. That gives us somewhere to start. I have a letter from a man in his late 20s, whose wife has died, leaving him with 4 children. Elizabeth dug through the letters on the organized chaos of her desk, and offered one to Jessica. Jessica read through the short letter. To whom it may concern. I'm 29 years old, and I have 4 children. My wife died giving birth to our youngest child, who was 6 months old. I'm in dire need of someone to keep house and care for the children while I work. I'm a dairy farmer, and I live in southern Wisconsin. I'm certain I could find a bride on my own if I had the time and inclination to court someone. I have all my own teeth and have been called handsome a time or two. My children deserve to eat decent meals, and my mother needs a break from cooking for us and minding the children. I hope that you'll find my plea worthy of your attention. There is no need to respond by letter. Simply send a telegram and be on your way. Someone will be at the train station waiting in DeForest for you. I live about 5 miles out of DeForest. Please know there will be hard work involved and you will be expected to do it to the best of your ability. I don't need any young, frivolous ladies coming here to me. I need someone who will take care of my children as their mother would have done, if she had lived long enough to do so. Sincerely, George Fleming. As Jessica read the letter again, she knew she was the woman George was looking for. At the moment, marriage and love didn't seem important to him, but someone strong enough to be a wife and mother was. She could be that wife. Surely, love would come later. Jessica looked up to see Elizabeth was working on something as she read. I think he needs me, she said softly. Elizabeth nodded. I think he does as well. He's not requiring a letter in response, and he sent the train fare and spending money for the trip already. Do you want to leave tomorrow? That seems so soon. I need to speak with my mother. Perhaps the day after tomorrow? I think that would be just fine. I'll buy the ticket and send a telegram to expect you. Will your mother be angry if you don't give her more time to adjust to you leaving? Jessica shook her head. Her dearest wish is to see me happily married with a family of my own. My siblings are difficult, but mother will handle them just fine. All right. I'll send Bernard to your home to let you know when the train leaves. Will someone be available to drive you to town? It can be a long walk with all your belongings. I'm sure my father won't mind a bit. Besides, that will be Saturday, which will free up my eldest brother. He can drive me to town if my father can't get away. Already Jessica's heart was on that train going west to marry a farmer with 4 children. She would go home, have a long talk with her mother, pack her belongings, and excitedly wait for her train to depart. While waiting, she'd help her mother do a fall clean of the house, so everything would be spick and span before she left. Bernard came in then with cookies and lemonade. Jessica started to stand, but Elizabeth shook her head. No, we must trade rotten sibling stories before you go. I guess we should, Jessica said with a smile. There were so many stories, and so little time. On her walk home, Jessica's heart was full. Already she was almost in love with the man who had been left with 4 children. She loved the idea of meeting his mother. She couldn't help but fantasize a little about George Fleming and his family. George would see her at the train station, and he would stop, staring at her as he prayed the woman he saw was Jessica. Upon meeting the children, they would all go to her and embrace her, telling her that having a mother was their dearest wish, and she was the prettiest mother they could have imagined. She practically floated in the front door of her home, thinking about how she had been chosen to be a bride. Finally, all her school friends seemed to have married and moved on with their lives. It was her turn. It had to be. Her mother was making lunch for the 2 of them when she walked in, and Jessica immediately set the table and cut off some pieces of the bread she and her mother had made the day before. Then she put a ball of butter on the table to go with the bread. Did you get the supplies ordered? Mother asked. Jessica nodded, then realized her mother was facing away. I did. And I did something else as well. Oh? Her mother carried the leftover soup from the night before she'd heated for their lunch to the table. Jessica poured them each a large glass of milk and then sat across from her mother at the long table they used for meals. I talked to Elizabeth Tandy. Her mother smiled. I was hoping you would. You were? Jessica had known her mother wouldn't mind, but hoping she'd talk to a mail-order bride agency was more than she'd expected. Mother nodded. Oh, yes. I see that ad every time I walk into the store in town, and I think of you. You'll never be able to marry here with the reputation your younger siblings have. They all need to be tied up and beaten, but that's just not the kind of mother I am. Jessica laughed softly. No, it's not at all. Well, I plan to leave the day after tomorrow. Mr. Tandy will come out and tell me when my train will leave as soon as they purchase my ticket. I'll be moving to Wisconsin, to a farm outside of a town called DeForest. Well, that sounds promising. What does your future husband do? Tell me everything you know. He's a dairy farmer. His wife died in childbirth 6 months ago, and he has 4 children. His mother has been caring for them, and now he's looking for a wife to take over from her. He said he has all his teeth, and he's been called handsome once or twice. Jessica shrugged. I'm excited to meet him and the children. You've always had good motherly instincts. It sounds like the perfect place for you to be. I think so as well. You don't mind that I'm leaving before we get the canning finished? I'll help you do the fall cleaning tomorrow. No, you won't, and no, I think it's wonderful you're leaving for such an opportunity. I have fabric I bought years ago, thinking I'd make your wedding dress out of it. We're going to make your dress today and tomorrow, and your sisters will help me with the housework, whether they like it or not. Jessica grinned. I can just imagine Maisie trying to cook and clean. Maisie was the next oldest of the Moore sisters, and she was 15. She simply had no work ethic. Jessica was glad she wasn't going to be there to listen to the fits her sister threw as she had to take on some of Jessica's duties. I'm not thinking about that yet, Mother said with a grin. Maisie will learn that there's more to life than reading and daydreaming. And she'll learn it quickly. I hope so. We'll start a stew cooking for supper, and I'll have Maisie cook the loaves of bread I made this morning. She'll learn quickly, or she won't. If she doesn't, the pressure from her siblings will make her learn more quickly. Jackson is not about to eat burnt bread. Jessica smiled. Jackson was 17 and the next oldest. He ate just about anything, and it was odd to see how thin he was. The boy never stopped eating as far as she could see. The next 2 days were spent sewing. By the following evening, Jessica had her train tickets, and she tried on her wedding dress. It fit perfectly, and she was excited to wear it for her future husband. For George. Elizabeth had sent a letter with Bernard saying she would meet Jessica at the train station the following morning. Jessica was excited to see the other woman one last time before she left. She had to thank her for what she'd done. Before bed that last night in the only home she'd ever known, her mother sat in her room with her. Do you have any questions for me? She asked. Jessica shook her head. Should I? Well, I wasn't sure how much you knew about the wedding night. Jessica laughed. I've seen cows and horses mating my entire life. I know how babies are made. Mother nodded and kissed Jessica's cheek. I know you're going to be a wonderful wife and mother. I'm just sad it won't be close so I can see you on a regular basis. Though Wisconsin is much better than moving to California or something. That would be much too far away. It would, Jessica agreed. I'll write to you, and we won't lose touch with each other. I'm sure I'll be asking for a great deal of parenting advice since I'll have a ready-made family. I'll answer everything I can as quickly as I can. Oh, I'm going to miss you so. Jessica embraced her mother. It's hard to leave my mother and best friend. It's just as hard to watch you go. I do hope you find love in Wisconsin and find your place there. Oh, I'm certain I will. It sounds like just the place for me. And his mother lives close by, so I'm sure she'll be of help as well. Jessica couldn't imagine a mother being anything less than helpful when her son and grandchildren were involved. I hope you have as good of a mother-in-law as I did. Jessica nodded. I hope so as well. Chapter 2. The entire time on the train, Jessica daydreamed about what it would be like to have George spot her and immediately know it was her, the woman who would spend the rest of her life with him and his children. She knew the children would immediately know her for their mother and fly into her embrace. The baby, who had probably cried the entire 6 months that she was alive, would see her and giggle for the first time. Oh, it would be wonderful, this mail-order marriage of hers. She met many different people on the train, and she told them all about the wonderful life as a wife and mother she was about to have. One woman, a retired schoolteacher, gave her account of what happened when she'd gone west to be a mail-order bride. My stagecoach was robbed before we reached our destination. One of the thieves had a very distinctive scar on his hand. I made it to the church unharmed, but much poorer than I'd been when I started out. When my betrothed took my hand in his, I saw the same scar that had been on that thief. I knew immediately, and I called a halt to the wedding. He was held there until the sheriff arrived and took him into custody. Then I had to return home, ashamed that I'd agreed to marry a man with no morals. I had the same dreams you do. Be careful. Though Jessica expressed sadness and empathy about what had happened to the older woman, she was certain it couldn't possibly happen to her. No, George was a good man of fine moral character. She just knew it. When her train arrived in DeForest, Wisconsin, Jessica stepped onto the platform, looking in every direction for the man who was supposed to be the love of her life. A farmer in dirty, old clothes spotted her and walked close. You Jessica Moore? He asked. Jessica nodded. This man couldn't be called handsome by any stretch of the imagination. Yes? George? The man shook his head and spit on the ground at her feet. Nah. I'm Maynard, George's older brother. He sent me to fetch you to the church. Oh, I want to change into my wedding dress before we actually marry. No time. It's harvest season. Jessica frowned. Could we at least collect my trunk before we go? Maynard scratched his head. I suppose so. Once her trunk was loaded, Jessica climbed into the wagon and sat as far from Maynard on the seat as she possibly could. He drove out of town, which surprised Jessica, and pointed out several things along the way. That's the Jackson farm, he said. Oh, and there's the Kaltenbergs. They have the biggest corn operation in this area. Maynard pointed out several things she didn't care about as Jessica sat nervously waiting to be introduced to her George. She already thought of him and his children as her own, and she wasn't even a bit ashamed of it. Maynard pulled up in front of a tiny church in the country. This is our church and where the children go to school. How many children does George have that go to school? Just 2. His 10-year-old daughter Nancy, and his 7-year-old son, Herbert. Does Herbert go by his full name or just by Bert? Or Herbie? Family calls him Bertie, Maynard said, climbing down from the wagon and walking into the church without even offering her a hand to help her down. Jessica said a silent prayer that George had learned better manners than his elder brother had. She walked into the church, feeling very conspicuous, but the only people there were George and a woman who was as well-rounded as Maynard was. She walked down the quiet aisle of the church to the very front, stopping in front of the pastor and the man she assumed was George. Instead of opening his arms to her, George hadn't bothered to look at her as she walked toward the front of the church, mocking her daydreams. She said another silent prayer that George was simply standoffish because of witnesses, but that he would be as loving as she'd dreamed he would be. The pastor went through the wedding vows, and Jessica stood beside the man who she would spend her life with, praying it would be a long, happy life. When the pastor reached the words, "You may now kiss the bride," George lifted one of her hands and barely touched his lips to it. Was he really that shy? As soon as the ceremony was over, George walked out of the church without a word to Jessica. She'd heard his voice during the vows, but he'd said nothing else to her. It felt as if he was rejecting her, without ever once really looking at her. The woman there took her arm and led her out to the wagon. "Maynard and I will take you to George's house, and you can meet the children." "I'm Jessica," she said softly, still in disbelief over the utter disinterest George had displayed. "I'm Mary Sue." "It's nice to meet you," Jessica fibbed. She'd wanted to meet her husband, not some random woman. "Are you Maynard's wife?" Mary Sue nodded. "Yes, I am. Maynard is the oldest, and George is the youngest. All of our children are grown and married." "How much older is Maynard than George?" 23 years. "We were married before George was born. He's always been more of a nephew than a brother to Maynard." "That makes sense. I'm the oldest of 6, but all my siblings are school age. My father is the oldest though, and some of my uncles and aunts feel more like they should be cousins." Jessica lowered her voice. "Why is George acting so strangely?" Mary Sue sighed. "He's been lost without Heather. When she died, it was like all the light went out of his life. He keeps working to support the children, but he finds joy in nothing." Jessica felt a tear prickle her eye. She wasn't certain if the tear was out of sympathy for George or for herself. It sounded to her as if she'd just married a shell of a man, and she had such good dreams about him. Why would he immediately act as if she was nothing to him? "I see," Jessica finally said. "I'll be a good wife to him. I certainly hope all will go as well as it can. The children need you so much. Especially little Sally. She's just a babe in arms, and she doesn't understand why she's not held with joy and love. How has he managed without Heather? Our mother-in-law is a good woman. Firm and strict, but good. She's simply too old to raise children again. She was 42 when George was born, and a woman of 70 does not need to be raising children." Jessica wanted to cry that she hadn't arrived 6 months before. She would have done all she could to keep the family happy. She wondered how long his letter had been waiting for her at Elizabeth Tandy's. She knew she had to be the right person to respond to the letter, but she wished she'd done so months sooner. They drove a short distance and Maynard pulled into a yard, between the house and the barn. The house looked as though it had been built for a much larger family than George had. As Jessica carefully got down from the wagon, she glanced around the yard, hoping to see a kitchen garden somewhere, but there didn't seem to be one. The trip had been quick, just 2 days, so the older children were in school. Maynard put her trunk on his shoulder and carried it to the front porch, which had a nice swing on it. Jessica liked the idea of sitting there to feed the baby. Maynard opened the door for her and called out, "Ma. If you want a ride home, I'm here." As Jessica watched, her new mother-in-law hurried out of the house, handed Jessica a crying baby, and got into her son's wagon. They were gone before Jessica could even ask when the last time the baby had been fed was. She stood and stared at the dirt stirred up by the wagon, and cradled the baby closer. This one must be Sally. She walked inside the house to see an absolute disaster. There were dirty clothes all over the floor that had obviously not been mopped since Heather's death. She looked around for the second child and finally spotted him on the floor quietly building something with blocks. "Hi, I'm Jessica. What's your name?" "Joe." "Hi, Joe. Has it been a long time since your sister was last fed?" Joe shrugged, yawning widely. He was just about as talkative as his father. "Why don't you take a nap, Joe? Can you show me your bedroom?" At her request, he stood and led her to a small bedroom on the second floor. The baby was still crying in her arms as she followed the little boy upstairs and tucked him in for a nap. He was obviously tired. Then she went downstairs with little Sally. She found a bottle that was still warm on the table in the kitchen, so she put the bottle into the baby's mouth. She had no idea what she was feeding the child, but hopefully someone would tell her before the day was over. Taking the tiny thing out to the front porch, she held her close and swung with her, hoping the baby would be put to sleep by the movement. There were obviously a million things that needed to be done that didn't include the baby in her arms. She talked to the baby in a soft voice as she moved the swing back and forth, and the baby's eyes drifted closed. She could feel the baby's wet diaper, and said a silent prayer the baby would fall asleep, and would not wake as Jessica changed her after her bottle. Shortly after, she changed the baby, and when she didn't wake, she wanted to do a little dance. Of course, she had no idea where the baby was supposed to sleep. She was just thankful there was a basket with clean diapers she found in the parlor. Instead of searching for the baby's room, Jessica put the 2 pillows on the sofa onto the floor for a bed, and covered the baby with a blanket she found in the basket of diapers. Leaving the baby to sleep, she went into the kitchen, and smiled when she saw an icebox. Opening the thing, she saw a ham that looked ready to be cooked, but nothing else was there. Looking around the kitchen and in the cupboards, she couldn't find any other food. She wanted to jump with joy when she noticed a small ring on the floor. A root cellar. Hopefully, there would be potatoes and other vegetables down there she could make to go with the ham. Going down into the cellar, she found potatoes and carrots sitting in baskets, and she happily grabbed some potatoes and some of the carrots, deciding that they would make a wonderful supper with the ham. There was no time to bake bread, so she would have to make more potatoes in place of the bread. She carried the food upstairs and dumped the potatoes from the skirt of her dress onto the counter of the kitchen. She was still surprised his mother hadn't at least stayed to help her find her way around the house. Putting the ham into the oven, she carefully sliced the potatoes into thin slices and boiled them into a pot of water. Glancing at the clock on the wall, she could see that it was almost 3:30, which meant the older children would be there soon. Hopefully, they were more talkative than Joe and their father. She had just started boiling potatoes when she heard the front door open and close. Walking out of the kitchen, she watched the children drop their schoolbooks on the floor and kick off their shoes. "Hello," she called to them. The oldest child, Nancy, walked to her. "Are you the woman here to pretend to be our ma?" "I'm here to take care of you," Jessica said, seeing immediately that the child wasn't about to warm up to her soon. What had she gotten herself into? Just like our ma did. The girl shook her head. "I have to share a room with the baby because you're here. Can you show me where I'm supposed to put my things?" Jessica asked. "This way." Nancy headed up the stairs, stopping at the last door on the right. "This was my room." "I appreciate you letting me use it," Jessica said, trying to sound sweet to the child, though she didn't feel even a little bit friendly with the way her day had gone. "I could share with the baby if I needed to. I'm sure I'll be getting up with her in the night." "Good idea," the child said. She walked to the first door on the right and opened the door. "This is the baby's room. There's a bed there for you to sleep in." Jessica looked at the bed and nodded. It was made for a child, but she was sure it would also work for her. She wasn't much bigger than most children. There was also a crib in the room for the baby, and though it may have seemed as if she was giving in to Nancy, the truth was, she knew it would be easier with her in the same room with the baby. "I'm going back to finish making supper," she said. Nancy just nodded, making Jessica wonder once again what she'd gotten herself into. The children weren't friendly. Their father wouldn't look at her. Their grandmother had left without a word as soon as she'd arrived. It seemed utterly ridiculous how alone she felt, but what she really wanted was to sit and talk about her situation with her mother and cry. Hurrying to the kitchen, she found the potatoes boiling and glanced at the clock again, so she'd know when they were done. She put the ham in the oven to heat, peeled the carrots, and started them boiling in a second pot. Bertie came in to stand and watch her cook. "Do you like to cook, Bertie?" "Boys don't cook," was the only answer she received. It was ridiculous how close-mouthed the children were when it came to talking to her. "Do you have chores?" she asked. He shrugged. "I need to milk the goat, so the baby will have milk." Jessica smiled. Now she knew what went into the baby's bottle and hadn't even had to ask. Maybe things would work out for her after all. Chapter 3. Jessica drained the potatoes and mixed up a white sauce, making creamed potatoes her favorite. Then she rushed upstairs to wake little Joe. The children still hadn't really spoken to her, but they stood and watched everything she did. Once Joe was awake, she moved the carrots to the center of the stove to cook faster, and moved the potatoes to one side to stay warm, but no longer cook. As soon as she felt like supper was under control, she hurried through the house, collecting the dirty clothes and children's books from the floor. She would have to do laundry the following day, which would be a challenge with the two small children. She just hoped Joe and Sally would be well enough behaved she could get the work done. She put the dirty clothes into a basket, and then gave the children their school books, instructing them to put them away and never leave them in the middle of the floor again. Nancy looked angry, but she marched up the stairs with her books, though Jessica could hear her door slam as she hurried around picking things up as she could. Joe sat at the table, looking as if he needed another 3 hours of sleep, but she couldn't let him sleep that long and expect him to sleep at bedtime as well. She woke the baby, which she was reluctant to do, but it would be best if the child was fed before supper. At the table there was a high chair that looked as if it had been handmade, and she was certain that was where little Sally sat during meals. She put the baby into the high chair and swept under the table quickly. She had a hard time understanding why George's mother had left the house so filthy instead of gathering women around to help get the place ready for Jessica. It truly looked as if the dining area and kitchen hadn't been swept in months. When she asked Nancy to set the table, the child glared at her. "Didn't you come here to do the housework?" "I did. But I only got here a few hours ago, and I've made supper and done many other things. I would appreciate your help with setting the table." Nancy stomped around as she set the table, obviously unhappy with Jessica, but just for a moment, Jessica refused to care. She should be the one stomping around angrily with the way the family had treated her, but instead she was doing the work that needed to be done for her new family, who were relying on her. When George opened the door, he immediately stomped the dirt off his boots there in the house's entryway, instead of taking them off outside as her father had always done. "I can sweep it again later," she mumbled to herself as she put the food on the table for supper. He said nothing about how the house looked, and neither did he greet his children. He didn't even look at Jessica. Instead, he walked into the kitchen and washed his hands using the pump there, before walking back out to the table. He sat at the head of the table and Jessica sat at the foot with the baby beside her. She had a small bowl for the baby, and she chopped up some of the potatoes and carrots into the bowl so they could cool down during their prayer. When the children started to fix their plates instead of waiting for a prayer, she knew this family was in trouble. "Aren't we going to say a blessing over our meal?" she asked. George looked at her with a disgusted look on his face, but he put his fork down and bowed his head, waiting for Jessica to pray over their meal. After the prayer, he and the children filled their plates as if they expected the food to disappear. "I didn't get here early enough to bake bread today, but I'll make sure to get that done tomorrow." George merely grunted, and the children ignored her entirely. She fed the baby tiny bites of the potatoes and the carrots while Sally pounded her fists and made noises that told Jessica that even if no one else was enjoying the meal, Sally was. When Jessica looked at the bowls of food, she realized they were mostly empty. The whole family had enjoyed the meal, whether they admitted it or not. While Jessica was spooning a bite of carrots into the baby's mouth, Nancy said, "Pa, the person you sent for to do our housework made me set the table." George looked at Jessica for the first time, and then he looked at his daughter. Doesn't hurt you to set the table. Nancy frowned. You said she was here to do the womanly work. Isn't setting the table womanly work? It is. And you need to learn to do womanly work, so when asked to set the table, you'll do it. Jessica was surprised to hear George stand up for her. She'd half expected to be scolded for not setting the table herself. What time do you want breakfast ready? Jessica asked. He shrugged. We get up at sunup. As soon as you can after that. I do the milking before breakfast, but I'm ready to eat pretty early. I can do that. Jessica thought about the breakfast meals she'd grown up eating. Would eggs and fried potatoes be all right for tomorrow? Maybe some of the leftover ham? That'd be fine. George was not a man of many words. He'd answer a direct question, but didn't seem to care to talk otherwise. Jessica suddenly saw the real future she'd signed up for, and it made a mockery of her daydreams and fantasies. She would be married to a man who never spoke to her, and she would need to clean his home, cook for his family, and raise his children. In return, she would get, well, nothing. She'd signed up to be a servant and not a wife. She wanted to start throwing dishes, but it would do no good. She wasn't there to be an equal or a helper. She was there to do all the work while everyone else watched. What a lovely life she had ahead of her. After supper, she cleared the table, changed the baby, then did the dishes, and wiped them by herself. Nancy didn't look like it even occurred to her she should be helping. Once the dishes were wiped and put away, she took the baby into the kitchen and gave her a bath in the sink. Sally giggled and splashed water everywhere, causing Jessica to smile. Maybe everyone else resented her presence there, but the baby, she only knew someone was caring for her. Maybe soon, Jessica would have someone good to her. She would make sure to raise the baby to be kind. After taking the baby from her bath, she diapered her and dressed her in a gown for sleep. Tomorrow, we'll do all the laundry, and everything will be clean. Won't that be nice? The baby cooed and patted Jessica's cheek. Jessica warmed a bottle from the jar of milk labeled goat's milk that was in the refrigerator. She took the baby straight outside to swing with her as she fed her the bottle. Little Sally slept in her arms, trusting her as if she knew her. The trust of babies was something that always astounded Jessica. She could be the worst person in the world, but the baby would trust her as she cared for her. Jessica carried the baby inside and up the stairs to her crib, laying the baby down gently. Sally's fist went straight to her mouth and she sucked on it as she slept the peaceful sleep that only a child could sleep. Afterward, Jessica went down to the parlor to find the family there. Everyone was involved in their own task, and no one was speaking to anyone else. Jessica's home had always been filled with loud, happy voices. This home was nothing like her own, and it bothered her to see all the unhappy faces. Was a kitchen garden put in this year that I need to harvest? Jessica asked. George shook his head but didn't bother to look up from his farmer's almanac. What will I do for fresh fruits and vegetables? She asked. She knew he didn't want to talk to her, but it would be so much easier if she simply knew the basics. All of my brother's wives set aside a portion of their gardens for us. They'll start delivering our share tomorrow, now that you're here to put things away. Oh, that's good. What do I do if I run out? He shrugged. 2 general stores in town. Gustafson's and Gunderson's. Across the street from each other. Let someone know you need a ride. Someone. Let someone know. She had to assume he didn't want her to let him know. I will do that. She hated that she was going to be cooking food that was grown by other people, but they were his family, and she would need to swallow her pride. Perhaps making biscuits in the morning to go with the eggs, ham, and potatoes would round out the meal, but she knew he wouldn't make his opinion on the subject known, so she didn't bother to ask. What can you tell me about the children? She asked, praying he would be forthcoming with information about his offspring. He shrugged. 2 girls and 2 boys. Baby drinks goat's milk. Bertie and Joe share a room. And with you here, I'll have Nancy and Sally share a room. She bit her lip. I told Nancy she could keep her own room. I'll be the one waking up with Sally anyway. Whatever you decide. He stood up and stretched. I've had a long day, and I'm heading to bed. Have to get up early for milking. Wait. Do the children have a bedtime? She asked. When you put them to bed is their bedtime, he said, striding from the room, obviously not much caring what she did. I guess that means we're all going to bed, Jessica said, standing. Joe and Bertie, I want you 2 to change into your night clothes. I'll be up to put you to bed in a few minutes. The boys ran off, going to do as they were told, which she took as a good sign. Nancy was sitting on the sofa, reading a book. As soon as the boys are done in the bathroom, I want you to get changed as well. Nancy glared at her. You're not my mother. Jessica nodded. I know I'm not. I'm very sorry your mother died, but you can't blame me for it, because I was in Massachusetts when it happened. Well, you can't tell me what to do. I'm afraid I can. Your father wanted me to take care of you children, so I'll be telling you what to do, so you know what's expected of you. Tomorrow I'll be doing laundry and baking all day. I want you to come straight home from school, to help me get the clothes in off the line. That's your job. Nancy said. It's our job. We're the women of the house now, and it's our job to ensure everyone is comfortable and wearing clean clothes. I'm not asking you to help me wash the clothes or hang them out, but I will need some help bringing them inside, and that's not too much for you. Jessica wasn't going to be mean, but she had to establish who was in charge. Nancy reminded her a great deal of her sister Maisie, not thinking she should have to do chores. How do you know what's too much for me? Because I have younger siblings, and I know what I could do at your age. So you'll do everything that I could do. Very simple, isn't it? I guess it is, Nancy said, looking down. I used to do chores with my ma. Did you like working with her? Nancy nodded. I remember how to do most things. It will be hard without her. I'm used to doing everything with my ma too, Jessica said. I left her back east, and I have to do everything on my own now too. Nancy's eyes met Jessica's for the first time. It'll be better for both of us to work together. Yes, it will. I'm really looking forward to having you with me. I'm going to get ready for bed. Nancy ran from the room and went upstairs. Carefully turning down all the lights on her way to the bedroom she was sharing with Sally, Jessica thought about what seemed like a breakthrough with Nancy. She was certain the child would cause her more trouble, but maybe it would help that she knew Jessica was missing her mother as well. Up in the baby's room, Jessica saw her trunk had been placed in one corner, and she was thankful. She had planned to bring everything up a little at a time the following day, but she knew she couldn't carry the trunk up on her own. Thankfully, George had understood that, and he'd done it for her. Perhaps he wasn't as indifferent to her as she thought. She quickly changed into her nightgown and climbed into the small bed that was off to one side of the room. She was sharing a room with an infant, and her stepdaughter was down the hall on her own. She didn't know how long she could continue to be kind when her new family did everything they could to avoid speaking to her. She would have to do her best. She prayed for her entire new family, hoping they would get used to her quickly. She would happily work hard for them, but she deserved at least a modicum of respect for all she would do, didn't she? She didn't even know anymore. Maybe moving to Wisconsin to marry a dairy farmer was not something she should have done, though her mother had cheered her on. She would write to her mother as soon as she found some time and let her know that she was all right. Not happy exactly, but not hurting either. It didn't take long for her to drift off to sleep. Instead of dreaming of a man who loved her, she dreamed of one who tossed all her belongings out into the snow. Instead of dreaming of children and grandchildren, she saw herself growing old alone. Sure, she would probably still be married to George, but she'd still be alone. Chapter 4. Sally woke Jessica up just as the sky was starting to turn pink with the sunrise. Jessica changed the baby, talking to her soothingly. Then she carried her downstairs and warmed up a bottle for her. Thankfully, Sally could hold her own bottle when she wanted to, and she sat in her high chair drinking her bottle while Jessica put breakfast on the stove. In addition to the ham, eggs, and potatoes, she made some biscuits and a bit of country gravy to eat over them. Her mother had been raised in the South, and it wasn't unusual for her to serve country gravy with biscuits for breakfast. She heard the other children waking, and they slowly went downstairs. When she spotted Nancy, she asked, "Would you please pull all of the sheets and blankets off the beds? We need to get them nice and clean for winter." Nancy reluctantly went upstairs to do as she was asked. Jessica would have given the boys the task, as she had no problem with boys doing women's work, but they were a bit too young to be helpful. Instead, she gave Bertie the task of setting the table, and Joe the task of watching his baby sister while she drank her bottle. George came in as she was putting breakfast on the table, and he looked surprised to see Nancy come down the stairs with an armful of bedding. "Good," was all he said, but Jessica understood that he agreed that Nancy should be doing chores to help the family. Before they ate, all of them bowed their heads, and George gave a simple blessing over their meal. Jessica was thrilled that he'd done it without even being asked. "What are you going to do today?" Jessica asked. George gave her a look that seemed almost frightened. "I did the morning milking already. I'll head over to Kaltenberg's today to make a deal with them for some of their corn to feed the cows for the winter. I need to sell the steer we have, so I'll ride into town to see when they're doing the next cattle auction. Lots to do. We need to let the cows graze for as long as they can, because they'll be in the barn all winter." It was a veritable speech coming from George, and Jessica treasured each word. "I'm planning on getting the laundry done today and baking enough bread for 2 days, so I will be able to clean most of the day tomorrow." He nodded, saying nothing else. Soon, he was off to work, and she was fixing lunches for the children, giving them ham sandwiches on biscuits instead of bread. She really needed to get that baking done, but laundry had to come first. When the children headed off to school, she went through all the bedrooms upstairs and found every bit of dirty laundry that was hidden. Apparently, his mother had taken care of the children and maybe cooked from time to time, but she hadn't bothered with any housework. She promised herself that if any of her children were ever in the same position George had been in, she would make a point of keeping everything clean. Jessica ran around like a chicken with her head cut off most of the day. She beat out every mattress and washed all the laundry. She was counting on Nancy helping her with remaking the beds after school, but she knew the child wouldn't be thrilled. Shortly before noon, Mary Sue drove up in her husband's wagon. "I brought you a couple of chickens for supper. I know the house is in bad shape, and I thought it would help a little." "Thank you," Jessica said as she finished hanging a diaper on the line. "We will be very happy to have chicken for supper." Mary Sue got down from the wagon, seeming to have nothing she had to hurry to do. Instead, she picked up one of the diapers from the basket of clean laundry and hung it on the line. "I love the warm months when we can hang the clothes outside and don't have to hang them in the basement. Don't you?" Jessica nodded, thrilled someone was willing to help. She had put Joe and Sally on a blanket together, and Joe was building with blocks, while Sally tried her hardest to get up on her hands and knees. "The little one will be crawling soon. Do you feel like you're racing time to clean everything before that happens?" "I do. I wasn't expecting everything to be in such bad shape when I arrived, I'm afraid. I didn't realize how bad it was until we were here yesterday. I wish Mother Fleming would have asked for help, at least when she knew you were coming." Jessica nodded. "I certainly understand she couldn't do it all at her age, but the children have been living in filth. If nap time were just a little longer, I could get so much more done. Mary Sue looked at her. I'll help you get everything hung, and then, if you don't mind, I'll take care of the children this afternoon while you do the cooking and cleaning. What about your cooking? Jessica asked. Mary Sue shrugged. Maynard will understand if I tell him I've been helping you all day. I'll talk him into taking me to the new diner in DeForest. Every time I've asked, he tells me I can cook, but if I haven't had time to cook, he'll take me. Jessica smiled. I didn't realize there was a diner so close. They just opened last year, and I haven't had a chance to eat there yet at all. Thanks for giving me an excuse that Maynard won't reject. Jessica laughed. I think we're going to be friends. Mary Sue nodded. I had 6 children, but all were boys. I think I'll adopt you as my daughter and help where I can. My daughters-in-law don't like me sticking my nose in. I will be thrilled for the help. I know I can keep up once everything is in its place, but coming into this mess with children to mind as well is a bit overwhelming. Jessica started the chicken boiling for supper while Mary Sue carried the baby inside and Joe followed her. What are you doing with the chicken? Mary Sue asked. I'm just going to make my mother's receipt for chicken and dumplings. It's a quick, easy meal that will let me devote most of my day to cleaning. I want the floors done as soon as possible. I don't blame you. Especially with this one almost crawling. Jessica sighed. I'm going to make some lunch super quick if you want to share my meal. That would be lovely. Mary Sue held the baby's hands as she tested out her legs, standing on her aunt's lap. It won't be fancy, but it will be filling, Jessica said as she headed into the kitchen. Warming the biscuits from breakfast and the scraps of ham that were left, she made a country gravy and turned the biscuits and ham into sandwiches, and then she covered them with the gravy. She made 1 for Joe, and 2 for each of the women. Then she knew she'd share hers with Sally. Mary Sue took 1 bite. This is delicious, she said. You'll have to tell me exactly what you did. This is a very simple meal, Jessica said, explaining briefly how she'd made it. The gravy is the best part of it, and I just used my mother's receipt. She grew up in the South, and she was always making country gravy. I will happily take that receipt if you don't mind sharing it. Of course not. Jessica said. I appreciate the help you're giving me today. I'm happy to do it. I want to see how you make your chicken and dumplings as well. Mine always turn out runny. We'll do that together. I wish I had cookies baked for you, but there just hasn't been time yet. Maybe I can make some before the older children get home from school. Don't try and do too much, Mary Sue warned. I don't want to see you too sore to work tomorrow. Oh, I was doing a lot of work at home too. And I walked into town often to run any errands the family needed run. I worked with my mother. That's really nice, Mary Sue said. My mother died when I was young, and I didn't get a lot of time with her. I hope Nancy listens to you. The girl doted on her mother and is very headstrong. Jessica sighed. We'll get there. Right now, she resents me because I'm asking her to do things the same way her mother did, and she thinks I'm trying to take her place. George won't even look at me. Bertie does whatever I say, but he doesn't speak much. Joe and Sally are the easy ones, and it shouldn't be that way. They'll all warm up to you, Mary Sue said. I certainly hope so. After lunch, Mary Sue gave Sally a bottle and then put both children down for a nap. She baked cookies for the children while Jessica scrubbed the floors. Jessica started to protest that she wanted to make cookies, but the floors were more important, and she couldn't ask a guest, even a sister-in-law, to scrub floors. Baking the cookies was a better task for her. By the time the children were home from school, the floors were scrubbed all through the house and the smell of cookies wafted through the air. Jessica washed her hands and hurried to wake the younger children. Then they all had a snack of milk and cookies together. Nancy looked around her in awe. The house looks like it did before Ma died. Thanks to your Aunt Mary Sue, I was able to get all the floors scrubbed today, and I have a wonderful supper cooking on the stove. We'll get all the bedding off the line, and you and I can make all the beds, while Mary Sue watches the little ones. Jessica looked at Mary Sue. Is that all right? I'd love to take care of the little ones. As soon as the snack was over, Nancy helped Jessica with the laundry, and they remade every bed. Won't it be nice to slip between nice clean sheets tonight? Nancy nodded. I used to help Ma on laundry day. I like clean sheets. I do too. Especially when they are dried in the sun and not in the cellar. As they worked together, Nancy kept up her chatter. One of the boys chased me around at recess today. The teacher says he's sweet on me, but it's hard to believe Johnny is sweet on anyone. He's always teasing me. It sounds like he is sweet on you. Does Johnny play tricks on the teacher? Nancy shook her head. Miss Dunbar licks all the boys who misbehave. I got licked once too, for not paying attention in class. It was awful, and I'll never do anything to get swatted again. Well, it sounds like you learned your lesson fast. Very smart of you. Nancy stopped tucking in the sheet and looked at Jessica. Why are you nice to me when I was mean to you yesterday? Jessica thought for a moment about how to answer. I married your father, and to me, that means we'll be married forever. So, you and I need to learn to get along together. If that means I overlook you being mean for a bit, then that's what I'll have to do. Nancy watched Jessica as if she was trying to think about how to respond to that. What should I call you? Jessica is fine. If you ever feel like calling me something else, that will be fine too. I don't want to call you Ma. My ma died. I understand. If my mother died, I wouldn't want to call anyone else by the name I used for her. Nancy seemed to believe her. All right. I'll call you Jessica. That's perfect. It's my name after all. As soon as the beds were all made, Jessica went to the kitchen to put the bread in the oven. Walking to the parlor where Mary Sue was with the younger 3 children, Jessica said, "Everything is done except getting the bread from the oven." She handed Mary Sue a piece of paper. Gravy receipt is on one side and the chicken and dumplings receipt is on the other. Thank you for all you've done for us today. I was happy to do it. What else do you need to clean before you feel your fall cleaning is done? Jessica sighed. Walls, windows, stove, icebox. I'll be back in the morning then. Just save a bit of those chicken and dumplings for me for lunch. Jessica laughed. I will. Thank you for helping me and being the only person who's made me feel welcome. Thanks for letting me play grandma with the babies. I'll be back. Clutching the receipts in her hand, Mary Sue went out and climbed into the wagon to drive home. If Maynard won't take you to the diner for supper, you two should eat with us. I'm not even going to tell him you offered, Mary Sue said. I'm eating at that diner. All right. Jessica laughed as she waved the baby's hand goodbye. Going back inside, she asked, Bertie, would you set the table for me please? Bertie nodding, his head hanging. I want to do man chores. Jessica couldn't help but smile. Do you want to go and hunt eggs? She asked. To her it was a womanly chore, but maybe to him it wasn't. Yes. Bertie took the basket from the hook by the door and headed out to hunt for eggs. I guess that leaves us women setting the table, Jessica said, walking to the table to put the baby in her high chair. Don't worry, Jessica. I'll do it. Nancy said, hurrying into the kitchen to get the dishes to set around the table. Thank you, Nancy. Jessica said, thrilled that the child seemed to be warming up to her. That meant the 2 babies and the oldest were starting to adjust to her being there. She only had to work on Bertie, which should be easy, and George. George was going to be the difficult one. She would have to keep on working and praying. Hopefully, he would see she had value other than as a servant to clean his home and care for his children. She didn't know what she'd do if he never realized she was more than that. One thing she did know, admitting defeat and going back to Beckham was not an option. Chapter 5. The next day went much smoother with Mary Sue coming to help out with the children while Jessica scrubbed the walls and worked on the kitchen. "Did you talk Maynard into supper at the diner last night?" Jessica asked. Mary Sue nodded. "It took a while, but he finally agreed when I declared I was too tired to eat, but he could make himself a jam sandwich if he wanted." Jessica giggled. "How was the food?" "After smelling your chicken and dumplings all day yesterday, I ordered their chicken and dumplings, and they weren't all that good. I don't think I'll be asking to go to the diner again anytime soon." "That's too bad." "Well, at least you know that you can make better chicken and dumplings than they can. I got you a roast for supper tonight. I put it on George's account. He supplies both of the general stores with their milk, and they give him what he needs as part of the payment. Anytime you need anything, don't hesitate to get it. He has a lot more store credit than he can ever use." Jessica smiled. "Perfect. We will happily eat that roast." After seeing the sheer size of the roast, she cut it into 2 portions, one for roast for supper that night, and she would make a stew the following day. There should still be food left over from each meal. Mary Sue and Jessica had little time to talk that day as Jessica was doing so much housework, but while the 2 little ones slept, Mary Sue did Jessica's ironing for her. "I don't know why I enjoy ironing so much," Mary Sue said. "It just feels soothing to me." Jessica laughed. "I'll make you a meal once a week if you'll do my ironing." "I would agree to that," Mary Sue said with a laugh. "I want to start with your chicken and dumplings. They are a favorite of mine, and they never turn out right for me. I know I have your receipt, but I'd love you to make them for us." "I would be happy to," Jessica said. "Just for you and Maynard?" "Yes, but enough to last a couple of nights, please." "I'm happy to do it." "What night are you thinking?" "How about Monday? I'll come over, do your ironing, and give you a chance to do some housework, and then you can make the chicken and dumplings for us." "That sounds good to me. I keep seeing apples that look ripe in the trees when I step outside. Would anyone mind if I picked the apples? I could make applesauce and even can some of the apples for apple pie filling later in the year." "I think that's a brilliant idea. We're all sharing our harvest with you. Perhaps you could share apples and some applesauce and apple pie filling." "All." "How many women are part of this?" "All of the wives. Mother Fleming had 8 sons. Everyone is pitching in because you didn't have a kitchen garden this year. We usually trade a lot anyway. Jennifer, Samuel's wife, tends to plant only potatoes because her family won't eat vegetables well, but she likes them. So I trade her carrots and celery and onions for potatoes. And so on. This year, you can trade apples." "Oh, that sounds wonderful. I'll do it too. The children and I can pick apples on Saturday. I'll do the laundry after church, and then I can make the applesauce and pie filling on Monday while you're here. If you don't mind staying a little extra, of course." "I don't at all. I would be thrilled to have apple pie filling in exchange for my carrots, onions, and celery." "And apples and applesauce? Cinnamon applesauce?" Mary Sue asked. Jessica laughed. "I always do plenty of cinnamon." "Then yes. I'm so glad you're here, and not just for George and his little ones. I think you will be a true asset to the entire community." "I'll certainly try." Once the older children were home, Mary Sue was on her way. "I'm making a real supper tonight." "I think that's a smart idea," Jessica said as she waved goodbye to the older woman. Nancy didn't drop her books on the floor and took them straight to her room instead. Do you need help? She asked when she came back downstairs. It seemed to Jessica that the girl had accepted her. She had a feeling it was because she hadn't insisted on being called Ma. Let me think. I got a lot done today, and I feel like we're mostly caught up with the fall cleaning. I know, why don't you wake Joe up, and I'll go get Sally. We can go for a walk and pick some apples. Nancy smiled, racing upstairs to get her brother. Jessica changed the baby, and the five of them set out with Joe and Sally in a wagon that Jessica pulled. Joe sat up, and Sally sat between his legs, sitting upright with his help. The two older children carried baskets for the apples, and there was also room in the little wagon for even more apples. It would be nice to be able to serve apple pie for dessert the next night. When they reached the grove of apple trees, Jessica and Nancy picked the apples while Bertie played with the two younger children. It wasn't long before both baskets and all of the extra room in the wagon were full of the bright red apples. Let's go back now. Your pa should be home soon, and supper is almost done. I just need to make the gravy. Nancy could carry her basket back with no trouble, but Bertie had to put his on top of the apples in the wagon. It was just too heavy for a boy of his size to carry. They carried all the apples inside the house and put them in a large basket where they would store them for cooking or distribution to the other women in George's family. Nancy set the table while Bertie played on the floor with the younger two children. Jessica hurriedly made the gravy for supper, realizing it was even later than she'd thought. George came in and washed his hands while Jessica was finishing up the gravy. Why isn't supper ready? He asked, frowning at her. Jessica closed her eyes for a moment, and then smiled sweetly. I spent the day scrubbing the walls and cleaning the kitchen, including the stove. I finished up all the fall cleaning, and then the children and I went for a walk to pick apples, so I could make apple pie for dessert tomorrow. I'm sorry to inconvenience you in my attempt to make dessert for the family. Just hurry and get it on the table. I work hard and expect supper to be ready when I get home. Instead of kicking him, Jessica stirred the gravy faster, wishing she knew exactly what to do about her difficult husband. He didn't even seem to interact with his children much. She knew he was still in mourning after the death of his wife, but that was no reason to be cruel to others. No reason at all. When Jessica put the food on the table and sat, George prayed before she was even settled. He obviously was ready to eat, and he was going to do it as quickly as he could. Jessica was too angry to try to make conversation with the stubborn man, so she asked the older children what they'd learned in school that day. Nancy shrugged. We had to write a story in class today. The teacher has never let us make anything up for an assignment before, and it was great fun. Bertie frowned. While they had fun, we had to learn our +5s. It was hard. Jessica smiled. What's 2 + 5? Bertie looked at her with a blank look for a moment before responding. 7. No more arithmetic. Sounds like you learned well. Jessica fed a bite of potatoes with a bit of gravy to the baby. It felt good to be caught up on the housework. Tomorrow, I'll be going through all of the clothing and seeing if there's anything that needs to be mended. Nancy looked down at her too-tight dress. I don't need to be mended. I need a whole new dress. And so you do. I saw some fabric on top of the armoire in the baby's room. I'll see if there's enough to make you a pretty dress. Is Johnny still chasing you at recess? Jessica asked. Nancy nodded. I told him he was a pest, but he didn't stop. By the look in Nancy's eye, Jessica could tell Nancy secretly liked being chased. Should I make an apple pie or an apple cake for dessert tomorrow? I've never had apple cake, Bertie said. Is it delicious? I think so. I even like it more than apple pie. I think we should have apple cake then, George said, feeling left out. His wife of 2 days already knew more about his children than he did. It was as if he'd just woken up and realized his children had kept going after their mother died. Jessica nodded. It was the first time George had made his opinion known of his own accord when he wasn't angry. I'll make an apple cake then. If you feel like picking fruit, there are rows of raspberries and blackberries out behind the barn. Enough for a great many pies and cakes. I'll look tomorrow. Mary Sue is coming to sit with the children during nap time so I can explore the farm and pick any ripe fruit I can find. Too bad you weren't here earlier. It would be nice to have some rhubarb. I can pick that in the spring, Jessica responded. There's a strawberry patch out behind the barn as well. That was where we planted all the berries. It's way too late in the season for strawberries, of course, but I'll pick them next year. She looked forward to planting her own kitchen garden and having the food she wanted at her fingertips. I usually plow a big section of the land in the back of the house for a kitchen garden every spring. Will that work for you? Jessica nodded, wondering why he was talking to her as if she was an actual person. It was the first time. That works beautifully. I do enjoy a nice garden. Just let me know what you need. A trip to the store would be most welcome right now. I have meat for tomorrow night in the icebox, but nothing past that. I have this strange feeling that the children will want to continue to eat through the weekend at least. His smile was slight, but it was there. Jessica wanted to dance, seeing that smile. It did make him look awfully handsome. I'll take you to the store on Friday morning, once the children are off to school. I'll enjoy that, Jessica said, smiling at the handsome man sitting at the head of the table. After supper, Jessica worked on the dishes, thrilled when Nancy appeared beside her. I'll wipe them. That would help me a lot, Jessica said. I love berries. Blueberries are my favorite. It's well past blueberry season, I'm afraid. I know. I picked a bunch when they were ripe, but Grandma said she was too busy to make a pie from them. Jessica frowned. I'll make you a blueberry pie next year. Nancy tilted her head to one side. Will you still be here next year? Of course, I will. I married your pa. I'll be here forever. Nancy was silent after that as she thought about the situation. When the dishes were done, Jessica thanked Nancy. I really appreciate you coming in here and wiping the dishes without me even asking. Nancy nodded solemnly. I always wiped the dishes for Ma. Then she was gone. George disappeared into the parlor while Jessica got the children ready for bed. He always read his farmer's almanac in the evenings, so there was no doubt in Jessica's mind that that's what he was doing. Jessica took down the fabric she had noticed before leaving the baby's room and carried it downstairs. Nancy was still awake, reading a book. Will this work for you? She asked, holding up the fabric. There was more than enough for a dress for Nancy, and Jessica thought she could also make a dress for the baby from it. Nancy nodded. I need a new church dress too. Nothing fits anymore. Jessica smiled. That's because you're growing. I'll find more fabric at the store on Friday. We'll make the dresses together. Nancy threw her arms around Jessica. Oh, thank you, Jessica. I love to sew. Nancy said her goodnights and headed upstairs for bed, leaving Jessica alone with George. I plan to pick more apples with the children on Saturday. I can pay back some of the vegetables we get from your sisters with applesauce and apple pie filling. George looked at her over the top of the almanac. You'll can them? He asked. At her nod, he continued. That's a lot of work. It is, but I do it every fall. I was a little disappointed to leave before we harvested the last of the kitchen garden back home. He frowned, putting the book down. Why did you come here, Jessica? She was a little impressed that he even knew her name. Because there was no future for me back east. I want to raise children and have a home of my own. She stopped short of telling him she'd been hoping for a love-filled marriage. Do you want to be a wife? She nodded. I thought I was coming here to be a wife and mother, as well as cook and clean. I'm not ready for a wife yet. I lost the love of my life just 6.5 months ago. I understand, Jessica said softly. Do you think you'll ever want a real wife? He shrugged. 3 days ago, I would have said no. Now, I'm not so sure. The children all seem to have taken to you. Even Nancy, whom I was sure would never speak to you. Well, I hope someday our marriage is a bit more than the mockery it is now. Suddenly waves of anger washed over her. She had come to Wisconsin in good faith, expecting to be a wife and mother. Instead, she felt like an indentured servant. She didn't mind the work as long as it came with praise and love. So far, it came with nothing. Instead of saying more, she walked from the room and went upstairs to bed. Someday the man would figure out what he was missing. Hopefully soon.